Thank you very much for hosting me today. It's a pleasure to be talking to you. My name is Saifedean Ammous, and I'm going to give a brief presentation on the case for Bitcoin for corporations. I wrote a book called The Bitcoin Standard, which explains the economics of Bitcoin. And in that book, I come up with a definition of how I understand Bitcoin. And I think Bitcoin can be understood as a peer-to-peer software for operating a payment network with its own native currency that is protected from unexpected inflation without having to rely on any trusted third parties. I think this gives us an idea about how Bitcoin operates. But the important thing about Bitcoin is that it has two very, very important properties, which I believe are unique to Bitcoin. And that is, first, it is the hardest money that has ever been invented. And secondly, it is the fastest money ever that we have ever invented, the fastest settling money across the world. I believe those two properties are key toward understanding the significance of Bitcoin for corporations. So what is money? To begin to understand the importance of Bitcoin, I start my book from explaining what is money. Anything can be used as money. People can hold anything and exchange it for other things. That's what money is. It's a medium of exchange. But there's a problem that once people start using something as money, its value goes up. And as its value goes up, that gives an incentive for people who can produce it to produce more of it, which brings its value down. Now, nobody wants to hold the money whose value goes down. So historically, we find that the things that get used as money are the things that are hard to make. So historically, we see that cattle has been used as money, limestones, rare seashells, glass beads, metals, precious metals, government money, or cigarettes in prison. All of these things work as money when they're rare, and they fail as money when they become easy to make. Government money, when governments do a good job in maintaining the scarcity of their money supply, it works well, but when they start printing it in excessive quantities, it fails. Cigarettes can work as money in prison when they're rare, because nobody can make it in prison, but once people get out of prison, they don't use cigarettes as money. So historically, we see that this has led to the fact that gold was the world's hardest money and the world's predominant money in the end of the 19th century, because it is the hardest money to have ever existed at that time. If we look at gold, we see one chemical property that's very important for gold, which is that it is indestructible. You cannot get rid of gold. You cannot destroy it. So all the gold that we have been producing over thousands of years has been piling up and accumulating in stockpiles all over the world. And that means that every year, we produce more gold, but that new production, even though it's more than the previous year, it's still a tiny fraction of the existing stockpiles, because the existing stockpiles are constantly growing. So as a result, if we look at the last 120 years, we see that the supply of gold increases at a percentage rate of around 1.5% to 2% per year. That's it. Even though we see that the supply is constantly increasing here, in the gray line, we see that the supply growth rate is always around 1.5% to 2% here on the right axis. So that's what made gold money up until the 19th century. And then when we look at the 20th century, we see that the forms of money that have been dominant, the government monies that have done the best, are these ones on the right here, like the US dollar and the euro and the Japanese yen and the British pound, because they've had a relatively low growth rate of their supply. They grow at an annual rate of around 5%, 2%, 7% or so on. And that's much better than, the very bad national currencies, which have had an average growth rate sometimes in 100%, in excess of 100%. And these currencies have had severe instances of hyperinflation with a lot of supply growth in their money supply. So this growth in the money supply with government money has led to an increase in prices. Government money grows on average much higher, on a much higher supply growth rate than gold. And as a result, we see that prices are rising. It's not that goods and services are becoming more expensive. Every year we have more of everything. We make more apples, more oranges, more computers, more cars, more houses. But these things become more expensive because the money is becoming cheaper, but the money is becoming worth less and less over time. So if we measure the prices of commodities in gold, we see that the price of commodities declines in gold because gold is very hard to make. But measured in national currencies like the dollar, prices of commodities are going up on the long term. So This, I think, is the main problem that is facing the world today economically. And it's a problem that has been constant throughout the 20th century with varying degrees. You know, some places have very fast inflation, some places have relatively slow inflation. But government money is the only form of money that has ever witnessed a sudden and complete collapse in its value, because governments can just print it at certain times in massive quantities. We've had more than 60 episodes of hyperinflation since the move away from the gold standard in 1914, and we've had many, many years of very high inflation. Government money is optimized to finance government spending, and it's not optimized for the people who use it to be able to save their wealth in it. This is why I think Bitcoin is important, because Bitcoin is the hardest money that has ever been invented. And I discussed the technical details in my book, The Bitcoin Standard. But suffice to say that the supply of Bitcoin increases at a decreasing rate. Every year, we're witnessing the supply growth rate for Bitcoin declining. We see it here in the gray line. Currently, Bitcoin's supply growth is growing at around 2% per year, so similar to the growth rate for gold. But it's declining every 4 years. The supply growth rate drops by half, roughly. So in the 3 years' time, it's going to be at around 1%, and then 4 years later, it's going to be at around 0.5%, and then eventually it goes to zero. In other words, the supply stops growing. Bitcoin's supply will reach 21 million, and then it'll stop growing. We just hit 18.9 million Bitcoins in circulation today, I think, or the last day or two. And as a result, now we've already mined 90% of all the Bitcoin that will ever exist. So the next 100 years or so of production of Bitcoin are only going to produce another 10% of all the supply of Bitcoin. We've never had anything like this. We've never had a form of money that is strictly limited, that nobody can make more of. There's no way to make more Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is appreciated at a compound annual growth rate of 200% per year for its first 11 years. And I think this is, you can only understand that as a result of this hardness, because as demand for Bitcoin increases, there's no way for anybody to make more Bitcoin. And so the only way to satisfy increasing demand for Bitcoin is for the price to rise. And that's why we've had this incredible growth rate over the first 11 years. Bitcoin has never been down over a 4-year time frame, because every 4 years, daily production of Bitcoin drops by half. So currently we have 900 Bitcoins produced every day. 4 years ago, we had 1,800 Bitcoins produced every day. 4 years before that, we had about 3,600 Bitcoins produced every day. And 4 years before that, it was 7,200. 4 years from today, it's going to be 450. So every year, 4 years, we drop the daily production by half. So that means that the marginal supply is dropping by half every 4 years. And that means that the marginal demand, if it stays constant, even if the demand stays constant over a 4-year time frame, you would expect that the price would go up, because the marginal demand, marginal supply is declining by half. So of course, the fact that you expect the price goes up drives a lot more interest and demand for Bitcoin, which means that the price goes up more than just by double. And over a 4-year time frame, Bitcoin has always been up something like at least triple or quadruple, and usually tenfold or 20-fold over a 4-year time frame. This is the annual performance of Bitcoin every year. We see that it's been astonishing. You know, 1 year is 1,400%, 189%. 5,400. We had only 2 down years in Bitcoin, but those 2 years came massive, large uptrends in the years before it. So Bitcoin's price is constantly growing, and I think the only way to understand it is because of the hardness. Now, that's why Bitcoin is the hardest money ever, but Bitcoin is also the fastest money ever. And that's because it can achieve final settlement across space faster than any other monetary asset. And Bitcoin, every 10 minutes or so, a new confirmation of all transactions is made. And that has never been rolled back. Bitcoin's consensus has never failed. So we've never had a rollback. We've never had a transaction annulled with Bitcoin. Once it's gotten one confirmation, we've not had it one confirmed. But you should expect more than one confirmation just to be sure. And every 10 minutes, you get an extra confirmation of your transaction. So with something like 6 transactions, you have a very high degree of certainty in your transaction that it has been finalized. And 6 transactions takes 1 hour. So with 1 hour, you can pretty pretty much get final settlement with a lot of assurance across space anywhere in the world. And that's very important to distinguish from that from consumer payments. This isn't like a credit card payment or a bank transfer. Even though a credit card payment can happen over a few seconds, that's not a final settlement of a transaction. That is just an authorization of a payment. And it then takes up to 2 months for the final transaction to completely settle, for the seller to be sure that the transaction will not be reversed. So there's a distinction between final settlement and approval of payments, and that's what credit cards do. Bitcoin is final settlement. It's more like some final settlement transaction between central banks. And the reason Bitcoin can achieve this is because Bitcoin has no counterparty risk. There's no counterparty involved in Bitcoin transactions. There's no trusted third party. There's no credit risk. The Bitcoin network operates without any kind of credit risk for any of the participants in the network. Nobody affects your credit risk. There's no political risk. The Bitcoin network has no politics. And there's no sovereign default risk. You don't have to worry about the central bank of the country that you're dealing with going out of business and then your assets being stuck and your assets being taken over by the government. There's no uncertainty about protocol rules, and that's the important one that distinguishes Bitcoin from all the other digital assets. So with all the other digital assets, we've seen very frequent instances of chain rollbacks where the transactions get reversed. We've also seen extremely frequent changes of protocol rules, and in particular, changes in the most important consensus parameters. But with Bitcoin, we don't see that. We only see marginal changes about the operational software for nodes, for individual nodes, but the consensus parameters of the network have basically never been changed. You can run a Bitcoin node that was built with the software of the first Bitcoin transaction back in 2009, and it would still operate with today's network. So there's no uncertainty about the protocol rules that govern the network of Bitcoin. And that's why it's the only institutional grade digital asset. And that's why it's different from all traditional financial assets, because all traditional financial assets carry counterparty risk, credit risk, political risk, sovereign default risk, and Bitcoin does not. Whereas all other digital assets, they can carry some of these risks, but they also have uncertainty about protocol rules, which is a massive risk. So Bitcoin is the only institutional grade digital asset. So when you think about it this way, it's the hardest money, it's the fastest money. It has no single point of failure. It has no single piece of critical hardware or infrastructure. It has no single critical individual or organization, which I think distinguishes it from all other monetary assets, be they government issued or digital assets. Bitcoin basically can't be stopped. It's just a protocol. It's a piece of software that anybody can use. It's open to anybody anywhere in the world. And every 10 minutes, it makes a new block of transactions. And it's basically never failed to make a new block. It's just always adding new blocks. And it's never confirmed a single fraudulent transaction in its 12-year history. And even if it would confirm, one confirmation is something that takes 10 minutes, you need several confirmations. And with each confirmation, it becomes harder to make this. The Bitcoin network, the processing power of the Bitcoin network to secure only 500,000 transactions per day is around 100 exahashes, which is around 10 million times the world's top supercomputer. It's about 1 million times the world's top 500 supercomputers combined. It's about 10 trillion times your laptop. It's an extremely secure network. The same number of transactions can be done on a single computer, but Bitcoin does it without relying on anyone on anything. And that's really the key thing. We use all of this processing power so that it is trustless, so that you don't have to trust anybody. You don't have to worry about your central bank or about your monetary policy or about your government's fiscal policy. It's just a piece of software and it works. So it's the hardest money ever invented. It's available worldwide for anyone who can receive 2 megabytes of data every 10 minutes. It's purely voluntary. It does not need regulation, enforcement, or police. International payments are now possible without having to go through governments and central banks. And I think the potential for that for corporations is enormous. You protect yourself from a massive amount of downside risk. And it's extremely important in today's world where inflation is becoming a bigger problem. And also, I think in the Middle East region, where we're seeing very fast inflation take off and hyperinflation in Lebanon and Syria and Iraq. So for corporations working in these areas, if you're obviously facing major problems with having to deal with the central banks in these areas. But I think Bitcoin provides an excellent alternative in that sense. It's basically the internet's answer to central banks. It's the alternative to central banking, and it's a software. It's like a network only, and that's the concept behind my book, The Bitcoin Standard. So it's the most advanced technological solution for value storage across space and time. If you care about meeting your obligations for the future and across borders, Bitcoin is your best bet. It's the best way to send money across time and across space. It's the perfect corporate treasury asset. That's really the key point. That's the case for Bitcoin for corporations. You hold it on your corporate treasury asset, and you hold it for the long term. Cash, bonds, and gold are all losing value next to inflation. Equity, bonds, and cash all have issuer risk, sovereign risk, natural disaster risk, and pandemic risk. Bitcoin doesn't have any of those things. And that's why, we see companies like MicroStrategy, and their CEO, Michael Saylor, has been very eloquent about this. They're placing all of their corporate treasury assets in Bitcoin, and it's worked out very well for them. And I think if you are able to, you need to have a certain amount of your local currency or your operational currency, maybe 1 year's expenditure, you have that in your currency, and then everything else, everything that you can wait on for a couple of months, wait on for a couple of years, everything that you want for the future, you can put it into Bitcoin, and you would expect to see it appreciate over time. And for MicroStrategy and for U.S. corporations, this is not such a pressing issue right now, getting around, capital controls. But I think for people operating in, countries with high political risk, this is another major bonus, which is that if you have your money locked up because of political risk, Bitcoin allows you to get around that. Thank you very much for allowing me to give this presentation. My book, The Bitcoin Standard, is now available in 30 languages. My second book, The Fiat Standard, has just been released, and it will soon be out in 14 languages. And I have another book coming in the next year. It's called Principles of Economics as a Textbook. And you can find more details on my work and my online courses on my website, saifedean.com. Thank you very much.